Hello, here we are at Fort Canning Park. This gate, built in 1859, was the focus of British military fortifications. For 100 years the British occupied Singapore, and it was considered the crowning jewel in East Asia's trading system. So when 85,000 British and Allied troops surrendered to the Japanese in February of 1942 after only 7 days of fighting, Winston Churchill deemed it the worst British military capitulation in history. Join us as we discuss how and why the invasion of Singapore occurred. Sally ports are small doors which lead in and out of forts. They are meant to help defenders enter or exit the fort undetected and to be used in case of attack. The word sally means to make a sudden, vigorous exit. If an enemy is besieging a fort, the defenders can try to make a sudden attack through a sally port and surprise the enemy outside. Fort Canning had at least 3 such sally ports. One here, one on the northwest side of the hill, and one on the south near Hill Street. Despite appearances, this is one of 2 decorative guns that once stood atop Fort Canning Gate. As with many of the features of Fort Canning, it was already obsolete by the time the fort was in use. In fact, the only time the fort was actually used for the military purposes which it was originally designed for was in World War II, when nor the hill, nor the walls, nor any guns would have stood any effect against the Japanese. So the history of Fort Canning really began in the 1400s, when obviously the Malaysian kings were still in control of this area. They saw it as a very auspicious jungle place, and they had loads of tombs in and around this area on the hill. However, when the British arrived in 1815, naturally they deforested the whole thing. But in 1822, they turned it into what we see now around us, the Fort Canning Botanical Gardens. It wasn't, however, until 1859 when the first gate, the Fort Canning Gate that we saw earlier, was actually built and the walls evolved around it. Let's fast forward to the Second World War and talk about the Japanese invasion of Singapore itself. Now, the Japanese swept across the entire Malay Peninsula in 2 weeks, so the British were largely unprepared. They got 1 week more by destroying the Johor Causeway, but after that, they knew the Japanese were coming. They were convinced that they would invade in the northeast, where there were much easier landing zones, and so the British put nearly all of their forces over here to the northeast. However, they left the northwest side, covered by mangrovey swamps, difficult areas to land, with only 2 Australian divisions. That was less than 1/6 of their entire forces. So when the Japanese actually came to invade after their 1 week's preparation, they were completely taken by surprise. The Japanese came in the dark on amphibious crafts, and the Australian divisions were firing completely blank at silhouettes in the moonlight. Completely overrun in the northwest, the Australian units were close to surrender, and the rest of the island communications were in complete disarray as the command tried to move 50,000 units across the entire island in a matter of hours. The unexpected nature of this attack, the British were very much unaware of the locations of the Japanese and of their numbers. What's more, the huge coastal guns that had been expected to repel a Japanese navy invasion from the south, though the majority of people don't know this, they could actually be turned around, but they could not fire high explosive shells, only armor-piercing shells. So they were completely ineffective against Japanese military. What's more, about 2 weeks prior to the invasion, there was a huge disagreement between British military commanders in Singapore, so there was very poor organisation in the battle box in the last few days of fighting in Singapore. Where the British were actually outnumbering the Japanese 3-1, there was intense fear, disagreement and argument And only 3 days into the fighting, the British decided to surrender Singapore to the Japanese. 85,000 men handed their lives over to the Japanese, who treated them incredibly poorly. They surrendered to 30,000 men.